Remember that shooting spree that killed 5 people in a gay bar in Colorado Springs just a little over 3 weeks ago? You'd be forgiven if you don't remember. That's because after days of intense media scrutiny, that shooting spree has all but disappeared from our discourse. The reason? It appears, sadly, that this horrific episode cannot be blamed on the corporate media's political enemies. The reason we heard so much at first about these Colorado Springs murders, as opposed to the countless other mass murder sprees happening in the U.S. every week that are apolitical in nature, is that the media was sure they instantly knew the motive of the killer. He was, of course, a gay-hating, right-wing, Fox News-watching fanatic, motivated by a deep contempt for LGBTs to the point that he wanted to murder them. Almost nothing was known about the killer, even less was known about his motive. But that made no difference. We were instantly subjected to a gleeful orgy from left liberal political and media precincts, insisting that the real killers, the ones who have blood on their hands, were not so much the killer himself, but conservatives who express criticism of LGBT dogma, usually the T part of that equation. Tucker Carlson, Chris Rufo, the Libs of TikTok Twitter account, various Republican politicians, the usual list of enemies of the media. These people, the media's ideological enemies, were blamed for this shooting in Colorado Springs, even though the media had no idea whether the killer had any opinion about those people they had blamed, or whether he had even heard of all of them or any of them. They just asserted with absolutely no evidence that the killer was motivated by anti-LGBT antipathy that he was taught by Fox News and whatever other individual politicians or activists most hated by whichever media figure was assigning the blame. Less than 24 hours after those murders, Pete Buttigieg, who is apparently still the Secretary of Transportation, even though he seems to talk about everything except transportation, wasted no time in pinning the blame on his ideological enemies. Quote, "If you're a politician or media figure who sets up the LGBT community to be hated and feared, not because of any of us ever harmed you, but because you find it useful, then don't you dare act surprised when this kind of violence follows. Don't you dare act surprised." Bernie Sanders did not even wait until the next day. On the very day of the shooting, he apparently knew everything about the motive of the killer and who was to blame. Quote, "Let's be clear. The terrible shooting in Colorado Springs this weekend is a direct result of the hateful and violent rhetoric that has been allowed to grow in this country. We must stand united with the LGBTQ plus community and speak out against bigotry everywhere we find it." That social conservatives, especially those who dissent from some planks of this very new gender ideology dogma, were the real killers was instantly consecrated as truth, even though it never had and still does not have a shred of evidence. In fact, lawyers for the suspect, Anderson Lee Aldrich, said in their very first court filings that Aldrich identifies as non-binary and uses they-them pronouns. News reports then discovered that Aldrich had sought a name change at the age of 15 and had suffered online bullying centered on mocking him as a homosexual. From the start, the police have said and continue to say they do not know his motive. And while some online extremism experts began doubting the authenticity of Aldrich's self-identification as non-binary, suggesting that perhaps he's just trolling, who knew that such doubts were allowed now over someone's expressed sexual orientation? Perhaps that's only confined to these online extremism experts. The picture that began emerging was very unclear at best and bereft of evidence to support the preferred narrative. That's why this media spree completely disappeared from sight. Without the ability to blame it on one's political adversaries, all the fun is gone. It has no utility. And thus it's of no interest in the media any longer. Nobody ever cared about those victims. The victims are only of interest if they can be exploited for political gain. All of this reflects one of the most demented and soulless new political tactics, to eagerly blame every mass shooting attack on one's political enemies, regardless of whether there is evidence to support that accusation. Now, just imagine, seriously, just imagine how sociopathic you have to be to hear about a mass shooting spree with multiple innocent victims and eagerly wait for the green light to blame your political opponents for the dead people. And if that doesn't come about because the motive isn't what you hope for, or you can't determine it, you just lose interest in the entire crime. Or you just fall back onto the standard tactic of blaming your enemies anyway because they're the reasons the guns were available in the first place. All of this, in turn, is based on an even more insidious premise. That words do not merely express ideas, but are themselves violence. This is the rotted premise, the principal one, that is causing more and more people to embrace the virtues of censorship. The idea that having centralized state and corporate authorities ban certain ideas is necessary to keep us safe because those ideas themselves are violent. For people who think this way, there is no difference between expressing an idea and pulling the trigger of a gun, because in their worldview, as they themselves say, words are literal violence, Now, there are many points to make about this morally bankrupt eagerness to exploit dead bodies as a tool to bash your opponents over the head with. And I'm going to make many of those points in just a minute because the practice is becoming more common, more reckless, and increasingly disgusting. But just to start with, it's a journalistic atrocity in general to assert claims about major news events without having the slightest evidence to substantiate them is journalistically indefensible. If the claims that you make about news events are completely untethered to any evidence, such as claiming that a mass killer was motivated by political beliefs you have no idea that he even harbored, let alone that caused him to act, it cannot be journalism. It's anti-journalism. It's highly likely to mislead the public, not inform them. And what is particularly striking to have watched them do this so brazenly in the Colorado Springs case is that they did exactly the same thing in a similar case, a much more consequential one, where they ended up radically misleading the public about what happened, a deceit that persists to this very day. On June 12, 2016, Omar Mateen walked into an LGBT club in Orlando, the Pulse nightclub, and indiscriminately shot and murdered 49 innocent people and wounded 53 others. The same narrative that was spun last month in Colorado instantly emerged from the media. The motive of the shooter, Omar Mateen, was that he hated gay men, hated LGBTs, in large part because he was an Islamic radical and an adherent to ISIS, and in part because he was perhaps himself a closeted gay man, lashing out with internalized anti-gay hatred. And I know that to this very day, millions of Americans believe this is true. They believe that this is what happened. I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you watching this show still believe that's what happened. I don't blame those who believe this. That's because it was virtually the unanimous claim of the political and media class from the start. The Huffington Post's Melissa Jelson collected just some of the headlines. Quote, let's say it plainly. This was a mass slaying aimed at LGBT people, Tim Tiemann wrote in the Daily Beast. The massacre was, quote, undeniably a homophobic hate crime, Jeet Heer wrote in the New Republic. Some speculated that Mateen was a closeted gay man. He was likely, quote, trying to reconcile his inner feelings with his strongly homophobic Muslim culture, James S. Robbins wrote in USA Today, and on and on and on. The Pulse massacre happened in the middle of the 2016 presidential campaign, and everyone from Hillary Clinton to then Attorney General Loretta Lynch made a pilgrimage to Orlando and definitively proclaimed, while the bodies were basically still warm in the morgue, that this was a hate crime against LGBTs. LGBT groups, such as the Human Rights Campaign, immediately began fundraising off this crime by using it to prove that LGBTs are still deeply vulnerable and hated, and they still fundraise off this narrative to this very day. Most media outlets that identified anti-LGBT hatred as the motive in the Colorado Springs shooting compared it to the Pulse massacre, which they casually asserted was also caused by anti-LGBT hatred. But this is not true. None of this is true. Omar Mateen was an Islamic radical and did proclaim his allegiance to ISIS. But not only is there no evidence that he acted with malice toward LGBTs, there is a mountain of evidence proving that was not the motive. Omar Mateen himself... Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.